Welcome to Decarceration Nation, a podcast about radically reimagining America's criminal justice system. You can find all previous episodes on our website, www.decarcerationnation.com. And if you like the podcast, please remember to hit like and to subscribe to the channel below. Eric Reinhart is the lead health and justice systems researcher, data and evidence for justice reform at the World Bank Research Group. He is also a resident physician at Northwestern University Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences. He describes himself as a political and medical anthropologist, psychoanalyst, and resident physician. Welcome to the Decarceration Nation Podcast, Eric.
Thank you, Josh. It's nice to be here.
Thanks so much for doing this. And you just told me you just literally got off shift, so it's very nice to have you here. I always ask the same first question. It's kind of the comic book origin story question. How did you get from wherever you started in life to where you were, doing this work about decarceration in terms of kind of public health? And I'm particularly interested in, what the pathway was that got you interested in this kind of work.
Trying to think about how far back I should
go as far as you want. Yeah. You can start at the very beginning if you want. We've had people start from when they were little kids.
Yeah. Well, without details then, from my childhood, there were people who were very close to me in my life early on who very much occupied a position at the margins of groups or of society, whether that was from disability or for other reasons. And this shaped me from the time I was very, very young. And I think that kind of oriented my interests, particularly around language. Some of the communities I grew up in when I was young were deaf communities, where the idea of somebody else speaking for you was incredibly frustrating and incredibly condescending. And as I've gone through life and I trained as an anthropologist, there's a tradition of anthropology that imagines itself as speaking for the downtrodden or those who have been marginalized by systems of power, etc., often from great intentions. And some of that work is actually politically very productive, but I always felt very uneasy about doing that kind of work. So for a long time, when I was doing my dissertation fieldwork as an anthropologist in Chicago, where I'd gone to medical school, where I had seen a lot of violence, I was very careful not to reproduce the history of urban sociology, of urban anthropology in the US that's particularly focused on racialized populations and systems of violence, like gang violence, like police violence, like incarceration, because I didn't want to be yet another external voice that was superimposing these kinds of narratives on others. So my work has always been about, until the pandemic, has been about the stakes of self-representation, the stakes of self-writing, what it means to write oneself from out of a context that's been so overdetermined by narratives of violence. When the pandemic started, things shifted a little bit for me because a lot of the people that I'd become very close to over a decade of field work and just friendship had cycled through Cook County Jail, other jails, prisons. And as part of my own work of tracing kind of the different spaces and power networks that have shaped their lives, I myself had moved through these spaces. So when the pandemic started, I was very keenly aware of the way that these spaces would have major implications for public health and the rest of society. And I felt like, okay, maybe this is a time I should start writing about these kinds of things directly.
Yeah, when I was, before I started doing this kind of work and before I became directly impacted, I worked in higher education and came across a lot of the threads of critical anthropology where they talk about things like this notion that you have to let people speak for themselves, not speak for them. And so it was very strange for me in some ways when I came into being an activist in the criminal justice field, how often people would say things like, we're a voice for the voiceless. Yeah. And, a very good friend of mine, Glenn Martin, said, no, we're not a voice for the voiceless. They have voices. You just have to give them a microphone. And, I've always taken kind of more of that or tried to take more of that. I think that's in the same vein of what you're referring to. Is that fair? Or?
Yeah, I think so. And I'm particularly interested not just in the fact that people speak. They're always writing. They're always speaking for themselves, but also the ways that people invent and create in the process of having to do so from the outside of power. And there's an inventive possibility that comes out of necessity there that I think has a lot of subversive political power and possibility that is not often taken as seriously as it should be. So yes, very much in line with what you're saying.
Yeah, there's a movie, I'm forgetting the name of it off my top of my head, but where I believe the main character is the Marquis de Sade, and they take everything away from him, including his tongue, and he ends up writing in his own waste on the walls because he just can't, he just has to have a way to present his own, his own words in his own way. So we will talk about a bunch of things, including kind of the public health case against incarceration, COVID in prisons and jails. I wanted to start this season off with COVID again because it's becoming a crisis again. Not that it ever really wasn't, but more acutely a crisis again. But to put everything in context, in some of the stuff that you've written, you kind of compare incarceration in the United States to kind of the rest of the world. What are some of the things that make the U.S. System stand out and not in a good way?
Yeah. Well, there's first of all what I think everybody at this point knows, which is the sheer size of the U.S. system. It's something like 20 to 22% of the world's incarcerated population is held in the U.S., which represents only 4% of the global population. So just the matter of size is remarkable. But it's not just the number of people that are held in the system at any one point in time that distinguishes the U.S. system, but also the pace at which people are cycled through it. So our jail system features about 11 million distinct admissions and releases every single year. About 5 million different people are represented within those 11 million admission release cycles. But at that scale, the idea that these spaces could ever be separate from our communities, as many people like to imagine, and traditionally in public health, this has often been imagined to be the case, it's simply not plausible. It's not a tenable idea when you have that kind of turnover. So I think that's one of the other distinctive features. Another is among wealthy nations, peer nations, as the US would like to think of itself in relationship to Western European nations or other nations with a lot of wealth, the conditions in US jails and prisons are horrifically poor. I mean, I do identify with a kind of abolitionist ethical horizon and also pragmatic demand now. In that context, still, you can look at places like Finland, Sweden, Norway, and I don't think prisons need to exist. I do think we need to have some form of custodial care in many instances, not many, but in some instances. I don't think that should be prison. But you can see facilities within their existing prison systems in other, like Nordic nations, for example, where the quality of care and facility, just material infrastructure, opportunities that are afforded to people for actual transformative shifts rather than simply retributive punishment are dramatically different from what you find anywhere in the US. So the US is not entirely unique in its incredibly punitive, retributive character of its penal system, but it certainly leads the world, I think, in its insistence on this, despite having more than sufficient resources to provide a very different kind of penal system.
You're at least do psychoanalysis, and you are an anthropologist. So do you have any ideas, or what do you attribute are kind of, I have a lot of theories on this myself, but what do you attribute kind of this unique commitment to just harsh, punitive, non-rehabilitative, kind of style of dealing with folks who've broken the law as opposed to other countries?
Well, psychoanalysis is, I think, a very useful discourse for thinking about aggression, hatred, racism. And I think what we see in the US is very clearly an instantiation of a deep sadomasochistic drive within American society, which I think you can find in every society, but it's expressed in different and contingent ways. The US penal system is inseparable from the history of US racism, the history of slavery, the history of the denigration of the figure of the Black. And this becomes codified in various forms, not just in the penal system, but also is entrenched in our economic system, in our systems of labor protections and hierarchies, all sorts of ways. But I think it's an inescapable, obvious reality that's what is negotiated through the US penal system is the designation of an object fit for hatred. There's this idea in psychoanalysis of ecstasy from Jacques Lacan The extimate relation is something that's characterized, but the thing that is most intimate to oneself, the thing that you can least tolerate about yourself, is externalized, put onto another, and made into a legitimate object of hatred, it's imagined to be, in that process. And I think what we see with the figure of the criminal, the racialized criminal, pathologized criminal in the US in particular, is a very strong instantiation of that kind of extimate relation. Why is it that in the US it's manifested through the carceral system? I mean, you have excellent historians. They're not necessarily thinking through psychoanalytic theory, but I don't think that's so important in this case. But like Elizabeth Hinton and Michelle Alexander and others who have developed many different historical threads and arguments to piece together the contingent manifestation of hatred in the US carceral system. I think that's probably more than I'm prepared to speak about, certainly today.
I am definitely excited that it's the first time we've talked about Lacan on the podcast, which I actually have spent way too much time delving into on my own. Before we, in one of your articles, you talk about two studies that show that higher incarceration rates drove significant increases in community-wide mortality, and this was not COVID dependent. So as we're sort of building the case towards where we start talking more specifically about COVID, do you want to talk a little bit about this as kind of a foregrounding?
Yeah, and if you don't mind, I would zoom out even further beyond the US. I mean, you invoked the international parallel earlier. So there are these two studies that you mentioned, one by Seth Prinz and his colleagues at Columbia, and another study that had an assortment of people, one of which is Jacob Kang from the Vera Institute as part of this. And both of these showed that at the county level, increases in incarceration rates, one was a causal study, the other one was correlative, but were very strongly tied to increases in overall mortality across the whole community for causes that can be linked to things that are exacerbated by the carceral system, whether that's infectious diseases that are transmitted across people, whether that's chronic diseases that are incubated and worsened in this space of intense healthcare neglect. So the fact that the US carceral system severely undermines US public health is not remotely unique to the COVID era. But what we see during the COVID era was also prefigured in many other prior epidemic outbreaks around the world. I think the clearest example, but it's not the only one by far, is the post-Soviet Russian TB epidemic. So in the 1990s, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, the disintegration of the welfare state there, increasing rates of poverty, there's also an increasing rate of petty crime as people needed to eat, needed to pay their rent. We know very well that poverty is associated with crime, and you saw that very clearly in 1990s post-Soviet Russia. With that, you also saw a near or more than 50% increase in the incarceration rate in Russia from 1990 to the year 2000. Coincident with this increase in the incarceration rate there was an increase in TB cases in the prison system across Russia. Not just TB or tuberculosis, but MDR-TB, multi-drug resistant tuberculosis. What you had is you had a lot of people that are going into the prison system, they're maybe diagnosed with TB and they're started on a drug regimen, but then they leave and it's interrupted as they go back to communities. They don't have integration with care there, especially as the Russian healthcare system is collapsing after the collapse of the Soviet Union. So you had a lot of disrupted treatment courses. And that is a prime opportunity for the development of bacterial mutations, resistance to the antibacterial medications that are used to treat tuberculosis. I'm mixing up my COVID terminology with TB terminology. And so you had the emergence of multi-drug resistant TB in Russia at a very high rate. And in Russia at that time, you didn't have access to the medications needed to effectively treat MDR-TB. So this is a huge problem for public health across the entire country. And what you saw was not just increasing in TB outbreaks inside prisons, but then as a consequence in the communities to which people returned, to which visitors returned, to which guards returned. So ultimately what you had between 1990 and it persisted into the late 2000s, the first decade of the 2000s, is a very large TB outbreak across Eastern Europe that actually went into Central Asia, went ultimately all around the globe. It's impossible to track adequately, but we have tracked it to places beyond just Russia itself. An epidemic that was spurred by the increased incarceration rates in Russia. We've seen this in Paraguay, we've seen this in Brazil, other studies that have shown that the increasing incarceration rates undermine infection control for TB, but also for hepatitis C, HIV, all sorts of other conditions. So that's the backdrop for COVID. So when COVID began, there were a lot of people, their voices didn't gain the traction that they should have, but a lot of people were publishing everywhere they could, speaking to everyone they could, to emphasize that if you have pandemic come to the US with our carceral system, an airborne viral pathogen like this, it is going to be quickly multiplied within these spaces that are very tightly packed, unsafe, don't have proper healthcare, and it's going to then roll back out into communities. And that's exactly what's happened. I think it's maybe happened at a scale that's even exceeded some people's expectations. But none of this was unanticipated. And not just because we've seen that mass incarceration undermines public health always in the US, but also because we've seen a specific epidemic dynamic elsewhere.
I mean, you would definitely think that if people just get the basic principle that people come in and out of prisons every single day, and if you make them an accelerant, that's going to mean more comes back into your community. I don't know why people don't get that, but people don't seem to get that. It's very confusing, which kind of brings us to COVID. Many of us all across the country worked extremely hard, screaming, yelling, jumping, doing everything we could possibly do to convince politicians that decarceration and vaccination for our brothers and sisters inside and for correctional officers was a moral and public health imperative. As an anthropologist, how would you describe what happened?
It's a good illustration of what's happened throughout the pandemic in US public health writ large, which is we knew what was going to happen. Anybody that had paid attention to the epidemiological dynamics around prisons, jails, anywhere in the world, had seen past outbreaks of different pathogens, we knew what would happen. There was not a dearth of knowledge that precipitated the crisis that came, or the worsening crisis that came, because there's always been a crisis within US jails and prisons. It was a dearth of effective political mobilization. And I think it implicates us, not just the lawmakers that we're constantly criticizing very appropriately, but we haven't figured out how to mobilize effectively to shift this system. And yes, one can decry it in moral terms, you can decry it in public health terms, it's completely irrational. You can use criminological evidence. I'm no fan of the field of criminology, which I think often kind of just perpetuates more and more research about things we already know the clear answers to. But leverage any field. This does not make sense. This harms everybody, and it especially harms the people who are inside, which are not just the 2 million people, but the 70 million people in the US that have criminal records, live with criminal records. Not all of them have been incarcerated, but a lot of them have. So what we had was total inaction, not total, but near total inaction. The level of action that we saw taken was woefully inadequate to the scale of the problem, and remains so now, 2 years in nearly. It was very depressing to me. At the outset of the pandemic.
Very depressing to me too.
I was really
It's still
hopeful.
very frustrating to me.
Well, when it first started, I shifted my whole orientation towards work. I'd never been interested in public work before, frankly. I didn't see that I had any particular potential to contribute to it. It wasn't something that particularly interested me. Not that I didn't think it was important, but other people are doing it, they could do it better than I. But I had an opportunity, I thought. I had been in the space, I had an idea, I had a quantitative study that would make a very clear case for what was happening and to implicate people's own self-interest. This should finally help, not just me, but all of these people working this way at the outset of the pandemic should finally help tip the scales and make the US public recognize that this system is deathly dangerous for everybody. You may not care at all about ethics, you may not care about racial justice, you may not care about the violence that's perpetrated in this system, but don't you care about your grandmother? Don't you care about your family or your neighborhood? Even if you live in wealthy north suburbs of Chicago, this affects you. But rather than kind of the decline of the carceral state in the US, what we've seen is its intensification. Right now, you have had a reduced rate of incarceration in state prison systems in many states, not all of them. But that's really accidental. It's just log jams at the front end rather than deliberate action to release people.
And a lot of those are somewhat artificial because you have increases in jail populations because prisons aren't taking jail prisoners for a lot of that time.
And a lot of people are not in jails or prisons who will be once the log jam is cleared. So we're going to see a dramatic increase. Whether it exceeds the prior incarceration rate, the incarceration we had as of the pandemic or not, I'm not quite sure. But it's nothing like what it looks like now, which is an artificially low rate. What you've seen that's more, I think, indicative of what's going to happen, what really has happened, is the federal prison population has gone up during the pandemic, or under Biden it's gone up. It actually went down under Trump.
Which, just to put aside, he did promise to reduce it by more than 50%.
Right. And it's increased. The ICE population has increased by 70%. I think it might now be about 50% over what Biden inherited when he took office. So we're seeing not the dramatic movement that I thought we might be able to see towards the end of mass incarceration, we're seeing the opposite. And this is incredibly frustrating to me. I mean, to speak of it as frustrating to me is almost obscene. Like, it's frustrating to 2 million people who are locked up. It's frustrating to millions of people who are affected by their family members being locked up. This is frustrating at a scale that, you know, far exceeds any one individual. Why did that happen? I don't know. What do you think? I mean, I know you're interviewing me, but what do you think?
No, I think about this all the time. You know, I led a very large scale effort to get decarceration and then vaccinations in our prisons. And we won on the second thing. Our governor did start doing vaccinations, and we're one of the states that's actually doing boosters. There's already been 10,000 boosters. So I'm very proud of that, but I'm very frustrated that our governor hasn't commuted anybody. I mean, well, 3 or 4 people in her, you know, in this time. And, you know, that's very frustrating to me. I wish I understood, because it seems to me the public health case is very strong. And I understand that people are deathly worried of you're allowing a jailbreak and someone recidivates and that one person then makes the whole thing look like a failure, which is what happens over and over again. People use anecdotal evidence to suggest that someone's move was incredibly risky. We've seen it in all levels. We'll talk about this a little bit more in a second. But, you know, I think, you know, it has to be, I think what you were suggesting earlier, there has to be something so deeply rooted after 50 years of tough on crime. And, you know, we've seen nothing but television and movies for 50 years that say that the only acceptable answer is harsh punishment for people who commit crimes. And no matter what the result of that has been, we've been told that over and over and over and over again in every single form of media and every single, you know, social experiment. I feel like it's got to be part of our blood at this point. And only the people who've actually experienced it, or know people who've experienced it or have come closely into contact with it, see enough of the truth of it to be able to. It's like there was an old movie where a guy would wear glasses and all of a sudden he could see all the aliens. And, you know, I feel like that's kind of what it's like. If you've been close enough to see what it's really like, if you put on the glasses, you know that the system is a total failure and it's bringing, you know, disaster to our communities, or at least certain communities. And, you know, if you haven't worn the glasses, you think you're still drinking the Kool-Aid, you know. And I think, you know, to some extent before I was incarcerated, I was probably drinking a lot of the Kool-Aid, even though I thought I was, you know, really in tune with all the social justice, you know, whatever. You know, I still thought, well, on the whole, the system's probably, you know, I mean, but, you know, you learn a lot in a short period of time, really. You know, I mean, I think the very first episode of this podcast, one of the first things I said was you'd have to be, you know, essentially blind to walk into a prison or jail in the United States and not see the racial disparities. That's still true. If anyone would be willing to walk in, they would see that. You know, it's just most people aren't willing to walk in, and the only way that they experience the criminal justice system is by watching Law and Order. And that is deeply dishonest and unethical television, in my opinion. And there's lots of examples beyond them. I just tend to pick on them. But
I mean, I think it's indicative of, so throughout the recent months in particular, I've been thinking of the U.S. prison and jail system as a microcosm of the rest of society. How we manage or fail to manage the pandemic there is a reflection of what's happening at a broader scale, more generally in American society. And I think maybe the same reasons that there has not been the movement that I maybe naively hoped there would be. There are
Well,
many
I want to push back a little bit because you've said that a couple times now, and I think the movement is there. There are a lot of people who fought extremely hard and worked incredibly hard to try to get relief to people. It just hasn't worked, so we're not doing it the right way. Maybe, I don't.
By movement, I didn't necessarily mean political movement. I meant like actual concrete policy movement.
Okay.
But I do also feel like I have, and I think by extension as a collective, we have not been effective in the way that we want to be. And I don't mean that as a criticism of people's intentions or commitment, but rather we need to figure out how to have more effective mass politics. We
definitely didn't win, that's for sure.
It's true, not just for decarceration, but it's true for all sorts of other policy platforms that have massive popular support, yet nonetheless aren't implemented. Like, how do we generate a kind of effective mass politics? So the movement is there. How do we translate that, social movement into effective policy movement? So that's what I meant to indicate. But I'm thinking, what you see with the carceral system, whenever somebody proposes mass releases, or even just releases, the initial response that I often see is, that person did something wrong, they deserve whatever comes to them, you must hold them accountable. It's always about individual virtue, individual responsibility. To shift the paradigm in the US from individual behavior, individual responsibility to collective responsibility is incredibly difficult. And we're seeing this now also with the rest of our pandemic policies. The CDC, the White House, COVID Commission, whatever. Everybody is reinforcing, even public health agencies that are ostensibly predicated on a collective epidemiological concept of health dynamics, of networks. Everybody's reinforcing this individualistic paradigm. Now we, criticize liberal individualism all the time, but then we reproduce it ourselves often as well. And I think it's so deeply rooted. It's hard. Yeah, go ahead.
Even within individualism, though, there's an old doctrine, that the exact name will probably elude me, but the idea is basically that what are you individually responsible for? Are you responsible for the predictable outcomes of things that you support? Like, for instance, if I gave a speech and I suggested a bunch of people attack the Capitol, am I responsible for that? We're seeing some of that work out in discussions right now. And some people say, yes, that you're not just responsible. That you're not responsible for utterances that you didn't have an intention to have a bad result, but when you say something that, as an individual that that could have a bad result, you are to some extent responsible for that. There's at least a theory of ethics that says that. Well, if that's true, and we know that these decisions we're making have poor public health outcomes, aren't we somewhat responsible for that, just like someone's responsible, for instance, for committing certain crimes or doing certain things? We don't get disconnected from the chain of agency of responsibility simply because it's not in the legal books or whatever, right? We're still part of the...
And I think ethically, in terms of interpersonal ethics, in terms of holding myself accountable in the world, how I engage with people, yeah, I'm with you. I think individual responsibility is important. Individual responsibility is not a framework for effective policymaking. It is not a framework for effective governance. It is not a framework for public health policy, and it's not a framework for effective criminal legal systems. We have to think about other ways of producing the effects we want to see in the world. So what we've seen is that a commitment to punitive individualism of the kind that we see in the US does not produce collective safety. It does not prevent crime. It does not, facilitate personal transformation or breaking intergenerational trauma, poverty. Does the exact opposite, more deeply entrenches all these things. So great, your ethical theory might say, I don't mean yours, I just mean one's ethical theory, might say, we need to enforce retributive justice upon this person. Okay, well, that comes with a cost. And that comes at a cost, not just to that person, but to their family, to their community, and ultimately to the country, ultimately to you, the one who's enforcing this punishment. This is why I said earlier, there's clearly a deeply sadomasochistic character in this. There's a sadistic character in the demand that the other be punished, and there's a masochistic acceptance of the consequence of this. And there's some weird, sadomasochism involves a kind of pleasure. I don't know what the pleasure is. There's a perversity in this pleasure. There's some kind of return that people get on this.
I've always suggested that people want to have permission to be, it's not that people are opposed to brutality or cruelty. It's that they want to feel like they're justified in when they utilize brutality and cruelty.
Yeah.
That maybe that's the reward. I don't know
Well, that one feels righteousness in the moment of an action of violence. There is a violent tendency. I mean, this is what I.
Oh yeah, how many movies have we seen where the victory moment of the movie is when someone finally kills the villain, or whatever,
or assassinate Osama bin Laden or whatever. I mean, not that I'm defending Osama bin Laden as a virtuous person who should have been treated so wonderfully, but the idea that these moments of violence are the moments of moral victory. This is deeply entrenched in our society, and I think it folds into the sadomasochistic drive that is constitutive of what it is to be a human being. So I don't mean that Americans are peculiarly bad. I think this is just like...
It's such a weird thing, though. Like, I think about this all the time. Like, I could see in that same situation feeling bad that we're at the point where the only way that things could be fixed is to kill someone.
It's imagined. I mean, it's the same logic of punishment that support that idea. Yeah. So yes, there should be a kind of sadness that there hasn't been successfully cultivated another kind of possibility. That the only imagined possibility for ending violence is yet more violence, which of course is never going to work in any case. But even if you think it is going to work, you should mourn that is the position you're in rather than celebrate.
You certainly shouldn't celebrate that I'm doing one of the worst things I can do as a human being, right, and one that we're willing to punish people for on a regular basis.
But we do this all the time as a society. And I think throughout the world, people do this. And I think until we, transform our imagination of our relation to violence and to collectivity, such that we can understand violence as reverberating beyond the object upon which it's enacted, the person upon which it's enacted, and we can take that very seriously, I think we're going to have a very hard time making some fundamental shifts. You can see this in Frantz Fanon, Martinican psychiatrist trained in France, and then was part of the Algerian and Tunisian kind of struggles for independence. He has this famous book, Wretched of the Earth. The first chapter on violence is read very, very widely. The last chapter, and that's like a full-throated embrace of anti-colonial violence. Jean-Paul Sartre wrote the foreword and kind of made this even more and more famous and more strident in how he rendered it in the foreword or preface, I forget what it is. But the last chapter of that book is Fanon, who's a psychiatrist, working with his patients, some of whom had been freedom fighters who had been tortured, some who were torturers themselves, French colonists. And what you come to, rather than the kind of very optimistic liberation through violence of the first chapter, is the recognition that anti-colonial violence, which is perhaps necessary, is important. This isn't a denigration of that, what I'm saying, nor what Fanon says, but that it reverberates, it doesn't end. And it comes back in your dreams, it comes back in your relations. The French torturer who tortures the freedom fighter and then goes home and tortures his own children and his wife, etc. There is no escape from this violence. And if we're imagining that we're going to make our world a better place or a safer place through just deeper and deeper infliction of violence on people's bodies and psyches, lives and communities, it doesn't take us where people imagine perhaps it's going to take us.
Well, and obviously it hasn't, right? I mean, it's funny, you see in the press almost every day, the object of scorn and the reason we have violence is apparently criminal justice reform, which we barely passed. I can name probably all the major pieces of legislation that passed across the country. It would take me a little while, but I'm fairly familiar with all of it. But it's not significant, and definitely, it is significant and has helped people, but it's not, the kind of thing that would cause but we have spent every year we spend $80 billion on policing, and yet we have an increase in violence. Who gets blamed? It's the criminal justice reform, not the policing, not the poverty, not the, it's always the thing that's the probably least responsible if you want to be, totally honest,
Yeah. So I feel like, you can invoke these kinds of high languages of violence, like I just did to some degree, not very eloquently, but I'm not very interested in that. I want to know what's going to have an effect. I mean, I can
I think we all do. I
yeah,
mean,
I mean, we
I've
can,
personally been involved in passing, I think it's now like 51 pieces of legislation that had, optimally some effect, and I'm very proud of all of that. But I'd really like for us to do some of the major stuff like, end, life and long sentences,
right.
or deal with life and long sentences, get rid of some of the more terrible abuses that are happening in our prisons, especially in the South, although not exclusively in the South. There's a laundry list that would go on for weeks, but
Right.
I mean,
And this is, I think, so important that we tether our work and our rhetorical work to the effect. And this isn't a criticism. This is just like thinking like this is what the challenge always is, especially as an academic. I don't have an academic position right now. I don't identify necessarily as an academic, but a lot of this work has been done within academic circles. What's rewarded within the university? Publications, notoriety, press mentions, not policy effect. I mean, of course, we all want that in some sense, but it's not actually what's incentivized. And so I think it takes a kind of a work, a dedication, a sacrifice sometimes, because sometimes effect doesn't come with all the other things that are rewarded. So how do we orient collectively our work towards effect? Almost everybody that I talk to in the US rhetorically seeks the end of mass incarceration, condemns this system. But very few people, and I don't mean you or others who are really engaged in this kind of work, but just in the general public, have a concrete sense of what that would entail, how that could be possible. What are the policy paradigms that we need to push forward? Who might represent them among the representatives that we could vote for now? Or why would we be discontent with the current options we have and demand something of a practical policy platform for doing that? This is not part of the common language in the US, at least insofar as I've seen. I maybe have a narrow view of it. But I think that's what we need to do. We need to push we have enough moral condemnation of these things, but we need like real policy movement. And how do we do that? And I'm not always sure it's through, through the moralizing languages, which are totally appropriate, but I'm not sure they're that effective ultimately. They deliver their own kind of satisfaction that often diverts energy from the practical work that needs to be done.
we have suggested several things, and we'll talk about that in just a second, that could potentially be solutions. But first, do you want to just tell people, obviously, in Michigan, at the initial stage, we had 144 people die in the first wave of COVID, and then we got vaccinations, and basically no one died until this month. And now we've had 6 more deaths. You've written about Omicron being a new kind of real and present danger. Do you want to talk a little bit about that before we get to solutions, just so people get a feeling of kind of the public health picture on why Omicron is again ramping this up? And like I said, we're already seeing the effects of it where I live.
Right. Well, one thing to say is that whatever numbers we hear, you can look up, and UCLA COVID Behind Bars is a great resource for that. The New York Times, until they stopped aggregating information because it wasn't reliable anymore and it was already limited, they stopped in really the end of March 2021. All the numbers that we can get, and I'm glad that people are pulling together the numbers, dramatically underrepresent the scale of the problem. So New York Times, which had the most comprehensive database for cases and deaths inside jails, prisons, and ICE facilities, they were only able to get information on about half of those facilities in the US.
And is that mostly because of lack of transparency from the DOCs and the jails?
Yeah. And there's no reporting mechanism. There's no regulatory infrastructure to demand reporting. Even that which is reported is not necessarily reliable. There's no supervisory structure to ensure that. There's no auditing structure in most cases.
Well, and when you get to jails, you're talking about counties. And so, in Michigan, there's 83 counties. That's, 80 something jails. And I honestly couldn't tell you. I have a very good idea of what's happening at the state level, but I have very little idea of how many people have died at the county level.
It's so disaggregated that there's a lot of power that's wielded by the individual administrators. In counties, that's typically in 80% of county jails in the US. The county jails are run by the sheriff. The sheriff is an elected politician in most instances. They have significant personal investment in not exposing bad things happening in their facilities, for which they are then held responsible and stand to lose electorally. They are politicians. They have political interests, and they're given almost total autonomy over the system and what's disclosed or not. You have prison administrators that the incentives are not quite the same, but they also have incentives to minimize what's happening, to not test adequately so as to discover what's happening, to record cause of death in a different kind of way, to release somebody to a hospital so they're no longer in custody and they die there rather than in their facility. We've seen this has been documented by the New York Times and Stat News and others. We've seen this in some instances, and this is happening all over in ways that are never documented, that no journalist ever gets a whiff of, and we don't know. So the numbers are huge. There have been, according to New York Times, their last data point in the end of March was 661,000 cases inside U.S. jails, prisons, and ICE facilities. But the number of so that's half of all facilities have recorded. And then also within those half of facilities, the vast majority were not testing to a remotely adequate degree. So we have no idea how many cases and deaths there have been inside these facilities. There have been, I'm confident, well over 1 million cases, certainly now, because that's 661,000 before the Delta and Omicron variants, which had huge surges. So definitely well over 1 million cases. I don't know how many deaths, many thousands. But each of those cases and deaths on the inside of these facilities translates to a much larger number on the outside. And this is what the research that you're going to speak to me about, I think, showed, which we started in Cook County in Chicago, and showed that when you had a big outbreak there in March and April 2020, about 3 weeks later, so April 19th, about 16% of all cases statewide, and coincidentally in Chicago, 16% also, were independently attributable to spread from the jail. So about 54% of cases that were linked to the jail. But once you do a multivariate regression and you control for these other factors that we know are associated with the spread of COVID at that time, which is population density, racial demographics, and you isolate just the independent association with the jails, 16% of cases. And at that time, there were thousands of cases across Illinois. So in a short period of time, you have the jail spinning out an enormous number of cases. How does this happen? People come through the jail. They often stay there only a number of days. They're exposed to a very high-risk space for infection. They get an infection, not everyone, but many. They are then discharged from the jail. In many cases, they've never been tested. If they have been tested, they may not have come out positive on the test because they haven't had sufficient incubation period to turn positive. They've been exposed, but they do not yet turn positive on the test. They go back to their communities thinking that they are, totally fine, virus-free. They may be symptomatic or may not be, and end up spreading to other people around them, unaware of what's happening. And you have multiplication of cases in this way. So I mentioned earlier, you have 11 million separate admission release cycles through US jails every single year. That's just local jails. That's a lot of opportunities for people to go in, get infected, go back out and infect other people. You have enormous proportions of incarcerated populations in the US who have been exposed to the virus and have become infected. So you have to expect that a large proportion of people who are cycled through jails are going to be infected. They are going to spread it. So we had a later study, a national study. Daniel Chen and I, my colleague at the World Bank, he's an economist and legal scholar in Toulouse in France, and also at the World Bank. And we had a later study, a national study, that tried to look at this at the national level. And there we found that really what that study was looking at was the effect of decarceration on reductions in COVID case counts in communities, or COVID case growth rates in communities. And we found that decarcerating was associated with significant reductions in the daily COVID case growth rate. By extrapolation, we can conclude that millions of cases and tens of thousands of deaths around the US are attributable to jail-related spread. But that study, none of the work I've been able to do so far actually has been able to account for staff. And you have people going in and out every day who are incarcerated. Sorry, you have people who are released every day who have been incarcerated. You have over 400,000 guards at jails and prisons in the US who go in and out every single day. They have extraordinary potential to spread the virus. And not just once. Now we see with Omicron or with Delta, many people are becoming infected multiple times. Each one of those times, they become an infectious vector for others. So the public health conclusion here is very simple. It's just these are epidemic engines. These are multipliers of infection that then spread disease to the whole of American communities. Also, we're in a pandemic. The US leads case counts across the world. A pandemic means that this is not isolated to one place or constrained by borders. It spreads everywhere. So the number of cases that have been spread internationally by the US carceral system is large. I have no idea what it is. Nobody can say, but it's significant. This is not just about US public health. This is about global public health. The US carceral system, the largest in the world by far, is a massive global biosecurity hazard. And there should be international pressure. There hasn't been so far as I know, but there should be international pressure to say, for reasons of global public health and biosecurity, this system has to be changed.
So one of the solutions you're just referring to is this notion that correctional officers should be vaccinated, should be responsible in a number of ways. I think most states would suggest that they currently can barely staff their facilities, that they're worried about that more correctional officers will quit or not show up for work if they mandate vaccines. And in many states, it's also a collective bargaining issue. I know you've suggested that the CDC might be a mechanism by which this could be checked. Do you have any kind of thoughts about how, I mean, as much as I'd like to just, bash the states and the systems because I'm obviously no fan, they do have, there are some problems they're dealing with here. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Well, I've retrospective critical thoughts that are not so helpful for now, and then maybe some other thoughts for now. So, I mean, if we're talking about the CDC, what was really upsetting to me and to a lot of people, I know you also, was that when the CDC was coming up with their guidelines for the initial distribution of vaccines, which, as many will recall, were in short supply initially, they came up with a system of prioritization. Healthcare workers were prioritized, often inappropriately. People who were actually at low risk of exposure, healthcare workers who are not directly involved in COVID care, were prioritized. People in nursing homes were prioritized, as they should have been. That was appropriate. Staff at jails and prisons and ICE facilities were prioritized, but not incarcerated people. And at that time, there was clear evidence that was available to the CDC. They were very well aware of it, that people who were incarcerated in the US were at higher risk of exposure than any other group in the country. For basic epidemiological reasons, for basic bioethical reasons, which that is the mandate of the ACIP group, ACIP group, kind of, that decides this prioritization schema, is to follow bioethical and epidemiological principles. They completely pushed that to the side and ignored this population. They refused to prioritize them. That's a massive abdication of responsibility, of basic public health responsibility, of bioethical, just whatever, a basic responsibility. I don't care what the qualifier is. And that harms everybody. Of course, it harms incarcerated people most, and then their families and their communities, but the whole country. So that was very frustrating. You saw it repeated with boosters. There has been no deliberate campaign by the CDC, which again is responsible for prioritizing booster allocation, to get boosters to incarcerated people, even though they remain at highest risk of exposure. And also, I don't know about highest, but one of the highest risk categories for severe outcomes. The risk of mortality and a significant morbidity for people who are incarcerated, who are denied proper healthcare in most instances, even though that's a violation of their constitutional rights. But legal rights, it's actually not codified quite in the Constitution. But
not that the Eighth Amendment seems to have much meaning with the courts anymore, but yes.
I mean, so this is repeatedly incredibly frustrating. And you see states follow suit. If the CDC does not give this guideline, many states refuse to prioritize people as well. Although it was within their right to do so, they generally refuse to do so. And you see now.
Well, and you've also mentioned that it's an accelerant for community spread. It's not only that it is incredibly dangerous to folks inside, including correctional officers, but
who have died at pretty high rates, and many have died. So that's very frustrating. So yes, the CDC could have done much better. Can they do something better now? Yes, they could launch a campaign, an educational campaign for states. They could work with the White House. I mean, the CDC has limited power to institute policy, but they can issue guidelines, and with their guidelines, they can influence policy to a very significant degree. So yes, they should do that. But now at this stage, it's about mandates. Not for incarcerated people who in general have actually had much higher rates of uptake than their guards.
We actually had 80% uptake in, which is higher than the general population.
But I think it's unethical and inappropriate to mandate vaccination for people who are incarcerated, who have their rights of bodily autonomy stripped from them generally and are extremely vulnerable and have good historical reasons to distrust medical interventions. I'm not at the point where I'm comfortable with saying that mandates for incarcerated people, forced mandates are, if you mandate it for a staff member, a guard, and you say, as a condition of keeping your job, where you are charged with protecting people who are incarcerated in this facility, part of your responsibility is to get vaccinated. If they don't want to get vaccinated, they can quit. Somebody who's incarcerated
that gets us. that gets us back to the problem, though, which is that in many, especially southern states, they've underhired or underpaid for so long that they're at risk of almost total system collapse because they're at such risk of from correctional officers. And like I said, it's also, in a lot of cases, it's a collective bargaining issue. So unless there's a public health mandate.
But you don't solve the staffing problem, which is real in some places and imaginary in others. Like, it's an imaginary problem at Rikers. It's a real problem in Georgia and Alabama and Florida and other places as well. But you don't solve a staffing problem by saying, okay, you're choosing to be a disease vector that can bring in an epidemic outbreak in this facility,
which is then going to thin out all your correctional officers
employees right now. So we'll just go with that. That's not a rational decision-making process. So to me, that's not a good argument for opposing mandating vaccines.
Well, that's definitely the right answer, which is you're basically protecting your employees by letting them spread the virus to everybody else.
And ultimately harm themselves and their coworkers and the people who are most vulnerable, which are incarcerated people. So, I mean, the real problem with the so-called staffing problem is that we have far too many people inside these facilities. We incarcerate at completely indefensible rates. So if you cannot staff the facilities that have a legal obligation to provide safe environments, because you cannot staff them, they are more unsafe than they ordinarily are, which is already illegally unsafe. These are incredibly dangerous facilities that are, feature rampant human rights abuses in normal times. Then clearly the rational response is we have to decarcerate, especially when it's clear that a very large proportion of people who are incarcerated in these facilities, their incarceration does not, by any stretch of the imagination, serve public safety. It does not improve safety for people in the general population. In fact, during a pandemic, it very clearly undermines it.
Well, this kind of gets us to kind of the last kind of important, weighty question I think we'll probably be dealing with. You kind of do, as you're saying, you land, like my podcast name, on the subject of decarceration, which, I obviously am very much for. Yeah. Here's the problem, though. Our movement is probably stronger than it's ever been in a lot of ways. It's, we've got more people involved than we ever have before. We've had a lot of, success at certain level more than we have before. But here's the thing. It doesn't seem like the vast majority of the people in this country believe decarceration is a good idea. It's an ever increasing number of people who are with us, but there's still an awful lot of people who are against us. So, it's one thing to say decarcerate. Do you have kind of a political strategy for how decarceration is possible? And I know that's a big question. You may not have an answer. It's something I struggle with every day. How do we get from here to there, I guess? Yeah.
There are different levels at which to answer the question. I think we have to answer it at multiple levels all the time. One is mechanistic. Maybe I'll put that on the back burner for the moment. The first one that I think is really important is we need a vision. I mean, you saw Trump be incredibly successful with manipulating masses, with producing political force, not for productive policy, but for whatever he wanted. You saw Bernie Sanders generate affective investment. People cared about the Bernie Sanders campaign. A lot of people who don't have a lot of money were giving money to it. They're going to rallies. There was a narrative that he crafted around the campaign that was effective. The Democratic Party historically has really shied away from affective politics, aesthetic politics, like the politics of feeling. And I think for a big project like mass decarceration in the US, which is going to take massive monetary investments, is going to take a shift in the ethical paradigms that kind of dictate policy and attitudes and behaviors in the US, we need a politics of mass feeling. We have to generate an effective narrative paradigm. So, Trump has his, Make America Great Again. Nobody knows quite what that means, but we need something like an organizing paradigm.
I think it means Make America White Again, but I'm just going to, it's a 1950s callback, right?
But I mean, in terms of policy, if you ask, well, what is the policy that is behind that exactly? Most people wouldn't have a very good answer for you. But he produced a rhetorical framework that generated things. We need to produce a similarly effective, and I don't mean similar in Trump's reactionary sense, but in the sense of generating mass feeling, of mass buy-in, a similarly kind of aesthetically charged movement that is backed by concrete policy demands that people can recognize and that people rally behind. So I think piecemeal decarceration is really important, but is very limited in its capacity to generate massive buy-in. So, you have like the New Deal, you have now the Green New Deal. We need something parallel to like the Green New Deal. You'd be hard pressed to find somebody in America who doesn't have some sense of what that is and probably has strong feeling towards it. A lot of people negative, a lot of people positive. But without a grand narrative, a grand ambition like that, I think it's going to be hard to generate the momentum we need for real decarceral movement. Now, I think even the marginal gains are important. The marginal gains represent people's lives who are no longer in cages. So I don't mean to denigrate that at all. I will do everything I can for any marginal gain I can. At the same time, I want to think about how can we produce a collective organizing framework where every politician in the US is held accountable to say, what is your stance on America's national decarceration program, on this specific proposal, on the target of reducing in the next 5 years, the incarcerated population in the US by over half, or these kinds of ambitious, as a provisional step, these kinds of ambitious proposals. I don't see that right now. We talk about people condemning mass incarceration. So Biden condemns mass incarceration on the campaign trail, gets into office, and increases the incarcerated population. So we don't have a framework by which to hold politicians and representatives accountable. So I think that's one part. The other part is that we need to work at the very nitty-gritty logistical levers that are available to us. So the lowest hanging fruit, because it's most obvious and also probably politically practical, is Biden's pardon power, governor's pardon power. In Colorado, you just had this exercise to a significant degree. Is it adequate? Not remotely, but it's something. Biden has 18,300 something pardon up petitions on his desk.
Sitting on his desk, yeah, absolutely.
He hasn't touched a single one. That should be like everybody in the nation should know that and think that that's obscene, especially it's at least duplicitous. Even if you aren't a big fan of mass decarceration, this guy said he was going to do it. He's doing the exact opposite. That should not be a defensible position. But most people aren't aware of this. How do we raise awareness around that and force that kind of mechanism? But then once you actually have people in power who are invested in this, we have a lot of mechanisms. So the Department of Justice and the Civil Rights Division, there's a lot of civil rights legislation that can be creatively used to force state DOCs to change policies, to force police departments to change policies. Local judges have power to release people. Sheriffs have power to release people and to change also the conditions under which people are jailed or conditions for which they are jailed, so that minor offenses or alleged offenses don't result in completely unnecessary jailing. We need to invest. Go ahead.
But that's sort of the tail wagging the dog in a sense. It gets back to the original problem, which is that politicians, to some extent, do what they do because they believe that the public is for or against what they're doing. It's very rare that a politician goes out on a limb. As you said, there's only 1 or 2 states that have even, made any kind of attempt at this, because it's very hard to get people to go out on a limb and do something they think is generally unpopular.
Yeah. You see it as an electoral liability. Yeah.
It's why since Ford, you see governors and presidents only pardon people and use clemency powers in their second terms, because they're term limited out after that.
And that's why I think we have to pair these two things. The first one, which is like this ambitious aesthetic paradigm, which generates not just the rational arguments that you and I could talk about the public health benefits, the public safety benefits, all these kinds of things that would come from mass incarceration, because that is abundantly clear if anybody cares to look at evidence. But what we're lacking is a mass mobilization of feeling in affirmation of this kind of an agenda, that we would see this as an ethical demand collectively as a nation. This doesn't really have a hold in the way that it needs to. How do we generate that at a mass level, not just within academic seminars, not just within niche podcasts, not just within the circles that you and I would like to run, but the average person out on Michigan Avenue when I walk out here today, that they know of this and they have a feeling towards it one way or the other. This doesn't happen right now. So I think in order to shift this impression that politicians have correctly, that mass decarceration or even just opposing the criminal legal system as it exists is an electoral liability, we have to shift public attitudes, and we have to invest in effective narratives to do that.
oddly enough, one of the closest we came to there at least being a national discussion was when Bernie Sanders talked about voting for people who are incarcerated. That actually did start a lot of discussions, and then it kind of died off. But that was kind of an example, I think, of where the traditional tough on crime narratives wasn't the only voice being heard in the room, and there was actually a discussion going on across the larger, social sphere or whatever.
Yeah. Bernie, in his first campaign against Hillary Clinton, he had this campaign video from Immokalee in Florida, agricultural workers. You can look it up on YouTube. And I thought it was an incredibly powerful. I might be a little biased in this sense, in support of this, but in support of workers' rights for migrant workers. But it was an incredibly powerful, aesthetically charged production. I haven't seen something like that, and maybe it's just because I'm unaware, that focuses on incarcerated people, the families of incarcerated people. There are a lot of, and I don't mean to be so crudely instrumentalizing, except for I think it's important that we tell stories. We do not have effective politics unless we generate narrative paradigms around which to organize them, not just rational.
We do have tons of those stories out there. The problem is they get used campaign by campaign, not as an overarching.
But I want to see them used campaign by campaign in support of a common cause, in support of a common policy paradigm that is being put forward. So that, a platform of an electoral campaign is, we are going to reduce in our state or nationally or in our county the incarceration rate by this proportion. We're going to do it by changing these policies, by not incarcerating people for all of these completely irrational reasons. We are going, these kinds, and I don't see that kind of organized connection of aesthetically appealing narratives.
Well, and I think another problem that we see is that these things get fed through a media machine that in a lot of cases is dominated by prosecutors, police, and former prosecutors and police.
Yeah.
You see what Alvin Bragg came out the other day with a fairly, let's stop putting people in prison for all these reasons. And everyone just were like, you've got to be crazy. It's like, you just don't, we're having a hard time getting to the microphone in the same way, I think, or having our ducks in a row in terms of how we talk about why that's a good idea.
Well, we also need to make new microphones. If you're expecting to win over the New York Post when you're making your decarceral arguments,
you're not going to win over
them. Maybe we need a different strategy.
Yeah, they're bad faith actors, so you're not going to convince them to do anything different.
But it's just good media practice to run a newspaper like the New York Post or like the Atlantic. You publish stuff all over, including reactionary, crazy stuff. That's just what you do. You make money that way as a media organization. If we're relying on persuading existing media apparatuses to take rational stances, to run these, it's not going to work. They are not, ethical political campaigns. That's not how they operate. We need to produce microphones for ourselves. You're doing it right now, but we also need to do this at a mass scale. And that has to be, a real focus of an effective political campaign. People know this, of course, and you see all these people investing, from Hillary Clinton to Bernie Sanders and many others, investing in their social media efforts and all these kinds of things. But I think we still have a way to go. I think there's a bit of a mimetic impulse in that. Oh, this works, let's do this, rather than an inventive impulse. And I think we need to invent a lot more in terms of how we use media narrative and grand narratives of ourselves, of what we could be collectively, in order to push the kind of policy changes we need. I feel like I talked earlier about what I care about is effect, and then all I've said are these vague general things without kind of real. But I think
it's tough, man. We're all wrestling with a lot of.
Right. I think I'm swimming around kind of in frustration, wanting to find some way to kind of push forward. And I feel like the work that I've done, which I worked as hard as I humanly could on it, it hasn't done what I hoped.
Yeah, I stand on the shoulders of of hundreds and hundreds and hundreds, mostly of people of color who've done this work for a long time, and I've probably had been part of as much wins as anybody, and I'm still incredibly frustrated because it's not what's needed. We need so much more, and the need is so obvious. So. People really liked that I asked this last year, so I'm going to ask it again. Were there any criminal justice related books that you've read that you might recommend to others? And if you don't have one right off the top of your head, that's fine too.
Well, Elizabeth Hinton's 2 books, I think, are incredibly important, but probably Khalil Gibran Muhammad's Condemnation of Blackness, I think, might be the most important book for me in this area. Probably because you said you haven't had Lacan appear in the podcast before, probably some psychoanalytic texts I think are important too, to think about the structure of sadomasochism, to think about aesthetics, pleasure, desire, feeling, and how that's operating within this very violent system, and how we have to not just suppress feeling, not just kind of deny that sadomasochistic impulse is there, but how do we effectively transform it into something productive to end these systems? So although it's not on the criminal legal system in the US specifically, I'd say maybe just like generally psychoanalytic literature on sadomasochism and affect, I think is quite important.
I always ask the same last question. What did I mess up? What question should I have asked but did not? This is probably, I just want to say this, of all the 117 previous episodes, this is the most off of my script I've ever gotten. We had actually a lot of dialogue that was back and forth. So,
well, I think you're proving my point there. You chose the wrong interviewee, but that was your first mistake.
I think that's good. I like when there's a lot of back and forth. I prefer to have discussions than, but I still do a lot of prep. So.
That's a very good question for an interview. I'm working as a psychiatrist for the moment. I never ask patients that. We don't ask patients that, but it would be kind of interesting to hear their answers.
I have, the church I go to, the pastor always, after his sermon, turns the mic over to the crowd to say, "What are your thoughts?" Yeah. And ever since then, I really appreciated the humility of that. And so that's kind of what I modeled this after, is always asking a kind of a humility question to end up with.
Nothing that I can remember now, and I don't think there was anything that's really stuck out to me as I thought that was really the wrong way to ask that question. But I think, right now we do have a lot of, so we talked in grand terms, or I did, maybe foolishly in some ways or naively, but we have a lot of practical questions right now that can be dealt with right now. And I think the vaccine mandates are incredibly important for protecting incarcerated people, for protecting staff at these carceral facilities, and the community at large. We've seen that mandates are very effective across various sectors of our society. We need mandates, and those can be enforced at the county level, at the state level, at the federal level. That has to happen. There's no legitimate argument for that not happening.
I'm a little worried that the Supreme Court is about to weigh in on that question, unfortunately, but...
Well, they're weighing in on Biden's capacity to do it. But there are a lot of other mechanisms by which that can be done.
Yeah, businesses can do it, that's probably... I'm just saying I'm a little nervous about what they're going to say.
I think that's important. And then, all these things feel so dissatisfying when I turn to vaccines. No, we need to release people. When you put all these little Band-Aids over a fundamentally broken, harmful system, it doesn't get me going. But we do need to do that also.
Hey, vaccine, look, like I said, we had 144 people die before vaccines in Michigan prisons. Since we got vaccines in Michigan prisons, basically nobody died until Omicron. And, that maybe is not what we want, but that's something. And it shows that vaccines are successful and that they protect our people. So
the vaccines are very important. There's no question about that.
Well, I really appreciate you taking the time, especially right after work. It was really nice to talk to you. I could probably talk to you for another, we covered a lot of stuff I'm interested in, including Lacan and Fanon and, a lot of other interesting stuff. So thanks so much.
Thank you. It's my pleasure. I'll see you, Josh.
Thanks so much for listening to the Decarceration Nation podcast. You can learn more about this episode in the notes or visit our website, www.decarcerationnation.com. If you enjoyed the podcast, please subscribe and please like this episode and leave comments below. Special thanks to Andrew Stein, who does the editing and post-production for me, to Ann Espo for helping with our transcripts and social media images, and to Alex Mayo, who helps with our website and does the video transcription. Make sure and add us on social media and share our posts across your network. Also, thanks to my employer, Safe and Just Michigan, for helping to support the Decarceration Nation podcast. Thanks so much for listening to the Decarceration Nation podcast. See you next time.